Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this Transiting Controlled Airspace workshop brought to you by Astral Aviation Consulting on behalf of the UK Civil Aviation Authority. If you'd like to stay in the loop with events and resources, please sign up to our mailing list, and you can do this by going to our website www.astralaviationconsulting.com or use the link that will be appearing in your chat box shortly. Signing up also gives you access to the replay for this workshop and a whole host of other safety resources. This evening, I'm delighted to be joined by Matt Lane, Dave Lewins, and Darren Lewington. By way of brief introduction, Matt is a head of training and an active single and multi-engine flight instructor and flight examiner. Dave joins us from Gloucester, where he's a freelance CPL and PPL helicopter instructor and also chief instructor and owner of his own fixed-wing PPL flying school, Eagle Flight Training. Darren Lewington began his ATC career at Southend Airport. He was an air traffic controller, instructor, examiner, and ultimately operations director at Gloucestershire Airport, where he worked for 25 years. He's a part-time ATC instructor and assessor at Global ATS Limited, one of the UK's 2 ATC colleges. He's held a PPL since 1997 and flies a Cub and an RV8. Welcome to the team. Okay, it's a 90 minutes of this evening, so over the course of the next 90 minutes, we'll break the workshop down into easily digestible chunks, as we often do, and we're going to cover what is controlled airspace, what you need to know when flying near controlled airspace, transiting controlled airspace, some top tips on staying out of trouble, always good advice, and then finally, as always, it'll be time for Q&A, which we'd always love you to take part in. So if you do have any questions, please do add them to the chat box or the Q&A box as you go through this evening. Also, I'd be really interested to find out who is in the room and who and where you're from. So without further ado, I'm going to pop up a poll. So please let us know who's with us this evening. PPL student, license holder, are you a lapsed license holder or other? Also in the chat box, we love the interaction in the chat. So please let us know where you're from, which part of the UK you're in, which part of the world are you in, where do you fly? Let us know, because that will have an impact on, of course, different types of airspace that you experience. Remember, if you're watching this live, the poll will pop up on your screen. However, if you're watching on demand, you won't be interact with the poll, but please do test your knowledge on the questions that are going to come up. Cool, let's have a look at the answers to that poll then. What have we got? Okay, great. So we've got some PPL students in here. Welcome, thank you. Good. Hopefully you'll get a lot out this evening. Some license holders, 82% of you. Good to see you. A couple of lapsed license holders and some others in there. So again, a broad smashing, but mainly license holders this evening. Thank you. Right, let's move on. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Darren, who's going to talk us through what controlled airspace is all about. Over to you, Darren.
Hey. Thanks, Chris. Good evening, everybody. I'm seeing lots of airfields all around the country popping up in the chat there, so it's good widespread. So, controlled airspace. What is controlled airspace? Before we get into the detail on this section, I think we've got another on-screen poll to come up. And the question is, what class of airspace is not used in the UK? There are a couple of these, but from that list, choose the one that is not used in the UK. There are 7 of them in total. But we use 5 in the UK, one of which isn't in that list. So give it a shot, see what you come up with. And there we go. Class F is the one that isn't used in the UK at the moment. We don't use Class B either, but Class F, we used to have Class F in the UK up until around about 2014, I think, when most of the Scottish advisory routes were Class F advisory airspace. That changed, and they're mostly Class E now with transponder mandatory zones and other bits and pieces. Okay, so what is controlled airspace? Quite simply, it's a tool that's used by air traffic control to protect aircraft flying in busy areas. It's not solely the preserve of airliners flying IFR, nor is it used to segregate IFR from VFR flights. It doesn't belong to the airports that have controlled airspace. It's something that everyone has equal rights and access to. We just need to know the rules and procedures that make that process simple and straightforward. So I've got a map coming up showing the UK extent of controlled airspace that extends to the surface. As you can see, there isn't actually that much. Lots of white stuff, lots of Class G airspace, and a couple of my own pictures there taken transiting over the Birmingham overhead and Bryce overhead, showing that this can be done relatively easily. So aircraft flying in controlled airspace are operating in what we call a known environment, where the controllers can provide separation and or traffic information to the different aircraft and different types of flights that are taking place. And the plan is to ensure that we have a safe, orderly and expeditious flow of air traffic. The air traffic service is provided, and arguably controlled airspace is probably the safest place to be. There's somebody getting paid to look out for you whilst you transit that airspace. When an aircraft infringes controlled airspace, the presence of that unknown dramatically increases the controller's workload, because now that known environment changes and they have to avoid any infringing aircraft, either horizontally or vertically, and that can be from 5 miles to 5,000 feet, simply because they don't know what that aircraft is going to do next. Hugely demanding for the controllers, and obviously has an implication for flight safety. Now, realistically, some pilots are daunted by the prospect of transiting controlled airspace. That may well be why some of you are here this evening. Some people avoid it altogether. And it has to be said that some of the industry bodies and organisations that represent general aviation tend to object to more controlled airspace as their default position. Personally, I think that's frankly a bit disappointing, really, because with the right knowledge and understanding, transiting controlled airspace should be straightforward and easy. If you're planning a flight that zigzags all around the country, avoiding controlled airspace, you might as well jump in the car and drive. I've been flying for 25 years and I've never been refused a zone transit. There isn't a secret code word or a special handshake. I just know how to use the system and the services. So let's look at the structure, type and classifications of some of the UK airspace. And we'll talk about these in a little bit more detail. They come in various shapes and sizes. Control zones, CTRs, control areas, and TMAs, terminal manoeuvring areas, are the ones that we'll principally see in the low-level airspace that we're operating in. So let's look in the first instance at control zones. These are the ones that we're going to come across most often. Tended to be traditional lozenge shapes, and you'll find them around the major UK airports, and some of the busier UK airports, and they extend from the surface level up to a specified level. In the UK, all of our CTRs are now Class D, and we'll touch on the classifications in a bit more detail as we progress. You'll normally find them aligned with the airport's main runway. You can see the Bournemouth CTR there extends around roughly 10 miles from the threshold in each direction, about 5 miles north and south of the airfield on the downwind leg. However, some of the more recent CTRs are actually quite a bit smaller and quite significantly more complex. And the Farnborough one is a good example there. It's a really odd conglomeration of shapes and different areas, so one that we certainly need to be aware of, because these CTRs, control zones, extend to the surface. Next one to look at are control areas, and they tend to encompass larger bits of sky above and adjacent to control zones, and they link airports to the airspace around them and the en route network of airways. In fact, airways themselves are actually just large CTAs, large corridors in the sky, really, joining different parts of the country. CTAs vary really quite significantly and enormously in size and shape, but their base level will always be more than 700 feet above ground level. And they're normally shown on charts and moving maps as an altitude. The base will be shown as an altitude. So we need to ensure that we're using the relevant and correctly set QNH when we're operating close and underneath CTAs, so that we can determine our vertical position correctly. Upper CTA levels are normally expressed in flight levels. Next one that we need to think about are TMAs, terminal manoeuvring areas. And the example on the screen there is the Manchester TMA, and you'll find these at the confluence of major airways or multiple airports. So Manchester is a good example, and the others, of course, in the UK, London being the Scottish, the principal examples. So we touched on airspace classification for these. And if we look at the classifications, and you'll find this chart in a whole variety of different places, ICAO actually have 7 classifications, and the classification of the airspace determines what activities and separations are permitted within each piece. The 7 named A to G are the international standard ICAO agreed, and the same all around the world. Class A to E are the ones that are promulgated as controlled airspace. F, as we touched on earlier, is an advisory airspace, though we don't use it, or B. And Class G is defined as uncontrolled airspace. Although unusually here in the UK, some airports do provide an ATC service, a full ATC service, to aircraft in Class G airspace. It's advisory in nature, meaning you don't actually have to comply with it, but it's delivered in exactly the same way as a service within controlled airspace. Controllers will expect you to comply unless you state otherwise. So let's look at these classifications in a little bit more detail. The 2 that we're principally interested in the UK are Class A and Class D. Now, Class A is the problematic one from a VFR point of view, because VFR flight is not permitted in Class A airspace. ATC separates all IFR flights from each other in Class A airspace, and the gotcha in some local areas, particularly in the London and Manchester areas, at the base of that can be quite low, 2,500 feet, 3,500 feet in Manchester, the levels that we typically operate as GA pilots, and you can find yourself in Class A relatively quickly in that neck of the woods. So we can't be in Class A airspace as VFR flights. Class D, Class D makes up the remainder really of most of the UK low-level airspace and includes all the control zones. Now, both IFR and VFR flights are permitted in Class D airspace. ATC will still separate IFR flights from other IFR flights in Class D airspace, but they'll pass information to VFR flights on IFR and on other VFR flights too. So it's an information basis for VFR, and the responsibility for achieving separation, not bumping to anybody else, remains with you as the pilot. So even in controlled airspace, in Class D controlled airspace, you still need to apply a really good lookout. VMC minima for Class D airspace. So when we're below 10,000 feet, the flight needs a visibility of 5 kilometers and must remain at least 1,500 meters, 1,500 meters horizontally, and 1,000 feet vertically from cloud. To be perfectly honest, that's quite challenging to judge and work out. So we've got a bit of a get out of jail card, really. There's an alternative for us VFR flights, that when we're operating at or below 3,000 feet and with an indicated airspeed of 140 knots or less, we need to remain clear of cloud and with the surface in sight. If we're in any doubt about the in-flight visibility, the controller looking after the controlled airspace can give you the current weather report for you to determine whether or not the conditions will allow VFR flight. Thinking about the priorities in controlled airspace, aircraft in emergency are, of course, number 1. Humanitarian, police, air ambulance follow, and there are some special flights such as VIP, royal flights, even calibration flights. Then it comes to normal flights. That includes IFR and VFR. If you filed a flight plan or you're talking on the radio in the normal way, you've got the same level of priority. Training flights, however, are bottom of the pile. Priorities, category Z, they're the lowest priority. Now, we need to be realistic. Much as I've said it's easy to transit controlled airspace, and I've been doing it regularly, sometimes it won't always be possible to allow an aircraft to transit. Just because the frequency that you're on is quiet doesn't mean that the controller or the airport isn't particularly busy. Many airports will operate multiple approach frequencies, a direct frequency or a talk down frequency, so you won't be hearing all of the traffic that's going on. Just touching on the services outside of controlled airspace, you may well be familiar with those that we already use and see on a regular basis, basic and traffic service whilst we're flying VFR. However, when you enter controlled airspace, you will be provided with a radar control service, and you'll be told as you enter controlled airspace that you're now under radar control. It's a type of service, so it's a mandatory read back item. When you're told radar control, that's what you read back. When you're in controlled airspace, the controller may well ask you what service you require on leaving. And they may even preempt that change, telling you, for example, that in 5 miles you'll leave controlled airspace, basic service. Again, it's a type of service. It's on the mandatory readback item list, so make sure you're reading back the service that you're going to receive next. Thinking about the activity status of controlled airspace then for a moment. We do have temporary controlled airspace popping up from time to time in the UK, particularly associated with Royal flights, not necessarily at airfields that normally have a control service. Kemble, for example, Cotswold Airport, Kemble down here in Gloucestershire, quite frequently hosts Royal flights, and you'll find a pop-up Class D control zone and some control areas joining flights leaving Kemble into the Airways network. So it's vital that we're checking NOTAMs before we get airborne, and making sure that we've got the current and latest information that we need to do that. Unusually at the moment, quite a few airfields are struggling to maintain their opening hours due to controller shortages, controller backlogs of training, and even some of the big airports are closing temporarily to allow controllers breaks. When they're not providing a service, the Class D control zone gets switched off at the same time. So you may well be planning to fly through a piece of airspace when it's closed. Again, checking the NOTAMs, checking in detail to make sure that it's not going to become activated again whilst you're right in the middle of it. That does happen, has happened, and it's generally reasonably well managed. But it's a fairly unusual situation that air traffic control units all around the country are short of people and having to change their hours. Now, we're lucky in some respects that many of the airports that have controlled airspace do actually publish VFR routes or visual reference points around their airfield that they regularly use for transiting and dealing with transit flights. Dedicated guides, some even produce dedicated guides with photographs of their VRPs that will really help you identify ground features that can help you navigate and follow a route that hopefully the controllers will be familiar with and that's easy to follow and easy to understand. It's worth checking the AIP entry or and the chart section for the airports that you're planning to transit through before you go, just so that you've got a good awareness of what's going on. So you might not plan to go into a particular airport, but worth a glance at their AIP and chart section just to make sure you've got all the data that's there. Okay, listening squawks. Clues in the name, really. Frequency monitoring codes is the correct thing, but listening squawks are recommended when you're operating close to busy and controlled airspace, and they enable the controllers to contact you if they need to. The clue, however, is in the name. Big bugbear of a lot of controller friends of mine say that the pilot will dial up the relevant squawk, then call up the frequency and tell the controller they're listening out. You don't need to call. It's a frequency monitoring code. It's a listening squawk. You only need to listen. The controllers will call you if you're getting close or if they can help you out. Back to you, I think, Chris.
It's back to me. Thank you. That's fascinating. Canter through that, Darren. We've got some good. It's got the juices flowing. Got plenty of people popping up in the chat with some interesting stuff in there. Thank you. I did notice some people, loads of people from different parts of the country. Some people from Perth in there, which is where I did my solo landaway all those years ago. I remember it well. So welcome. Really, again, really interesting because the airspace is different in different parts of the country, isn't it? So you got, I know there's people, someone from Shobden there, the Shobden Magnet, as Dave and I will remember from back in the day. You can't see the thing until you've flown through it. But of course, that's got a completely different airspace structure than people find down by Farnborough or Manchester, or whatever. So hopefully that was informative for all of you. Okay, right, let's move on to what we need to know about flying near controlled airspace. Over to you, Matt.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for the engagement so far. Let's start this next section, as is traditional, with another poll. So let's have a look. Here's just something to get you thinking. If you're flying 5 nautical miles away from and towards the boundary of controlled airspace at 90 knots, roughly how long will it take me to be inside it? Let's have a look at the answers. 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes, or 6 minutes. There's going to be loads of factors depending on ground speed due to wind of the day and things like this. But this is just something to just have a bit of a think about. So 5 nautical miles away, you're flying at 90 knots. Roughly how long will it take to be inside it? Have a guess at that, and we'll have a look at some answers. Let's have a look at the answers now then, please. So yeah, the answer was 3 minutes. Great. Quite a lot of people obviously doing some mental maths on the sofa at home, doing that as well. So great. Yeah, of course, in a still window, yeah, answer was B. The point is, what we're trying to get across here is that even in a relatively benign, fairly normal speed, 90 knots PA-28 Cessna or home built or whatever, things can get to you on top of you quite quickly. 3 minutes, actually, if you're distracted or things are happening, it is going to be, you're going to be on it or inside it potentially very quickly. So let's have a look at a few things that we can think about when we're flying near controlled airspace then as well. So first thing is, Darren's already touched on it, but an airspace infringement, let's get this clear. It's an unauthorized entry of an aircraft into notified airspace. That's not just controlled airspace. That's prohibited or restricted airspace, active danger areas, ATZs, radio mandatory zones, transponder mandatory zones. So there's a whole set of airspaces that can challenge you with an infringement. We've already said that it makes it very hard work for the controller, but ultimately it can be a very serious safety incident, and a loss of separation is what we're worried about here as well. So the CAA, the air navigation service providers, GA groups, organisations, everybody is working still to try and raise awareness of this issue and cut the risk of infringement. But we're still getting 1,000+ airspace infringements each year here in the UK. So as a community, we still need to keep on this issue and still trying to think about why it's happening and what we can do to mitigate it. So let's have a look at a couple of things in relation to this as well. So the mental model, as I call it as well. I mean, do we still look at a chart before going flying, or are we starting to rely more and more on electronic flight planning software, moving map devices and apps there as well? And it's important to remember that even if it's a moving map, very much the predominant presentation there is a flat view of the intended track as well. But the advantage that the electronic planning, through, as we've shown in that little screenshot there, is you can get that side or vertical profile there as well, which is really, really useful. And what we want to think about is, how close are you going to get to other aerodromes, private strips, gliding sites, restricted areas? And it's not just the lateral separation, but it's the vertical separation along our planned route. And that's what we need to be thinking about when we're building that mental model there as well. So what I suggest to people is, do not get airborne unless you've got an outline plan in your head. So try and study the airspace in advance, not only in a lateral plane, but in the vertical planes as well. And paying particularly, particular attention to what deviations you may need to make in terms of your vertical profile, as well as your lateral profile as well. So if you can think here, I've just put a little route in, just say from Little Rissington to Coventry going overhead, Wellesbourne there as well. Things you'd want him to be thinking about is, I get out of Little Rissington, I'm going, what height have I got to be overhead Wellesbourne if I'm planning to go overhead them, or do I need to go clearance? How's Birmingham airspace stepping down going to affect me? And if you can see there on the side view there as well, if you just plan to climb to 3,000 feet and just go towards it, you're soon going to run into trouble with Birmingham's airspace. And Coventry as well interacts with Birmingham in some quite tricky ways as well. So the more you can do to plan ahead and get that mental model in your head before you get airborne will help you cope with any distractions or challenges in flight. So I've talked about vertical limits and lateral boundaries. So let's just have a look at a couple more examples on that as well. So next slide, please. Darren's told us all about the different types of airspace and the constructs, but I think it's important that we understand, and I noticed somebody in the chat mentioned this, airspace may not be aligned to easily seen geographical boundaries there. So the vertical construction can also be very layered, not necessarily aligned to boundaries that you might necessarily be able to visually see there as well. Here's an example here. This is an area I do a lot of training and examining around as well. But look at what we've got here, I've ringed some of them in red here as well. We've got some bases of airspace there against flight levels, some against London QNH, some surface to 3,500 feet with BRIs there. We've got other areas that are up to flight levels with danger areas there as well. So it can be quite challenging with your vertical profile in this area as well. I mean, I know we teach spinning in this area to the south of BRIs and to the north of the airway there as well. Low pressure day, you can be climbing on QNH and you can get quite close even to that flight level 8.5 or certainly some of that flight level 6.5. It can really trick you there as well. So you need to look not just at the figures, but what the figures are based on very much when you're pre-flight planning or you're ascertaining where you are in there. The other thing I'd like to talk about is pressure settings. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Before we do that, the Take Two campaign. So when flying in proximity to controlled airspace and able to, the CA recommend that Take Two is the way to think about this. And what they're suggesting you do is you plan to remain 200 feet from the base of controlled airspace or 200 feet over the top of an ATZ or danger area, and or 2 nautical miles from the edge of any notified airspace. Now, I've had some people say to me, oh, well, Matt, you're just suggesting I put a buffer on the airspace. I'm either in the airspace or I'm outside the airspace. Why do I need to put safety margins and buffers on top of what's already there? That's what I've had some challenge for. And it's a reasonable challenge. But what I suggest is this is all about allowing you time to react to inadvertent deviations of heading or level that could result in an infringement. So if you get distracted or you have to divert around weather, this gives you a buffer before you get against controlled airspace. So it's not trying to expand controlled airspace, it's trying to give you a threat and error management buffer. That's what this is all about. So let's move on. We will talk about pressure settings now. So next slide, please. And a significant number of infringements are caused by pilots using an incorrect pressure setting on their altimeter. So they might believe they're remaining outside controlled airspace, but they're actually flying higher or lower than they think they are. When you're considering it, you must make sure it's appropriate for the area that you're flying. So let's have a look at a couple of the types and just remind us here as well. So when QFE is set, as per the top left-hand diagram there, your altimeter is going to indicate your height above the elevation of the aerodrome. And this is useful in the visual circuit environment. It's very much a military thing. I accept that. It's very still common in the military. But you should not be using QFE outside of the air traffic zone. When the QNH is set, that's the bottom left-hand diagram, your altimeter is going to indicate your altitude above mean sea level. And when the airfield QNH is set, the altimeter will indicate the elevation of the airfield correctly at the aerodrome reference point. Okay. Now, QNH is essential for avoiding airspace which has a base defined as an altitude and any prohibited, restricted danger areas that have an upper limit defined as an altitude. And when you're flying, remember to try and check and update, if necessary, the QNH you've set. And you should be able to get that from an air traffic service unit or maybe even listening to an ATIS on there as well. Now, the other thing that is out there, very much a UKism really, is RPS, regional pressure setting. And it's a forecast, not an actual value of the lowest atmospheric pressure at mean sea level within an altimeter setting region. So this is over a big area here as well. And aircraft using this setting will never be lower than the indicated altitude. This is what it's all about. And this was introduced in the past to aid terrain clearance in large areas of the UK where there was no local QNH or there was communication support, or for military aircraft that can cover a lot of airspace very quickly, say night, low level, with tactical flying and that as well. And use of regional pressure setting in an inappropriate area can be a real cause of infringements there as well. So it's very important you don't use the RPS when you should actually be operating on a proper, appropriate QNH when you're near controlled airspace. The other one out there as well is the standard pressure setting 1013, and that will give you flight levels and that. And standard pressure setting should only be used when flying above the transition altitude as well. And at or below the transition altitude, you should really be using Q&H, unless you're really wanting to operate near airspace that's defined by flight levels. And I gave you that little example near Bryce there as well. Final point from me before I hand on to Dave to talk about transiting control airspace is about mapping and some of the map layers that we've got there as well. So next slide, please. So just a few pitfalls. These devices, moving maps, are brilliant, and for really good decluttering reasons, a lot of the devices will automatically declutter airspace depending on your current flying level and very much depending on what settings you set up within the apps. Now, this is why pre-flight study is really still appropriate to build that mental model that I mentioned earlier. And just a little example here as well. I've given a very short distance flight from Benson to gliding site Sandhall Farm as well. You can see on the pre-flight planning that you can see all of the airways that I talked about earlier very quite clearly. Now, if we go to the flying mode there as well, you can see some of the higher airspace disappears based on some of the settings in the app as well. Now, if we hadn't done our pre-flight study well and we hadn't built that mental model, you could potentially climb out of Benson if you're in a very decent performing aircraft with a strong westerly wind, and you could inadvertently climb into some of that airspace if you weren't then monitoring the moving map or exploiting the alerts that are in the app there as well. So, you know, use the mental model, be aware of decluttering features, and, you know, understand how your app will declutter, and very much understand what settings you've got in there as well, because you can change very much how the app responds with dynamic airspace. Absolutely brilliant features, and gives you great situational awareness, but make sure you've got it set up and in a way that you understand there as well. The final thing I'd like to point out is there is some really good information, advice and resources on the Airspace and Safety Initiative website as well. The team will put the link in the chat box there as well. There's loads of things on there about hotspots and local narratives from some of the local airspace user working groups as well in there as well. And there's examples of people that have suffered infringements and actual narratives of what went on and maybe some lessons learned. So there is lots of really good things to read in there as part of your ground school, or even if you're having a safety day at your club or airfield. There's some good things to pull from there. That's all from me. I'll hand back to Chris. Thanks very much.
Lovely job. Thanks, Matt. Some really good stuff going on in the chat there, particularly around the Take Two campaign, which is interesting. My take on this, and Matt, please jump in if you think this is incorrect, is we should try and use the Take Two where we can. If it's possible to do it, then great. If you're in the Manchester low-level corridor, as Steve points out, it's only 4 miles wide, that's going to be a bit difficult. But if you can, then apply that buffer just to be, you know, add that 2 miles for mum, basically. That's my take on it. Matt, any other thoughts on that?
I think the thing for the Take Two is, and I tried to allude to it, I don't know if I got it across that well, it's not for the controllers, it's not for the CAA, it's for you. It's to give you a buffer so that if you get distracted or you have to deviate or things go slightly wrong or you're slightly inaccurate in the account, it gives you that little bit of buffer before you're up against it. So, you know, if you can't do it or you don't want to do it, that's fine, but it's a mitigation for you and not the controllers, and that's the way I like to think of it.
Good, great, thank you. Lovely job. Right, transiting controlled airspace. Over to Dave.
Thanks very much, Chris. Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. Well, let's have another quick poll, please. Out of preference, on a VFR flight, would you normally plan to route around controlled airspace or route through it? So answer A, through it. I avoid it like the plague. C, depends on the weather. D, depends on my flying currency. So let's see, through it, avoid it, or depends. See the results of that, please. Interesting. Okay, there's obviously no correct answer. I was interested to see the spread of results. It's probably, the webinar is obviously aimed at mainly at pilots who are a bit nervous about risking it, rather than those who are happy with the idea. I do it a lot, most days on aerial photography flights. We go straight lines for obvious reasons whenever we can. I can honestly say we rarely get refused. and also as my students will testify, I do a zone transit demo nav1 of the PPL to get any worries cleared up from the word go and show how straightforward it is. And on their solo navs, I'll always throw in a zone transit. We've got pretty busy airspace around Gloucester as well, so they're pretty used to using radios. But any of you that are nervous on the radio, I definitely recommend you get an instructor and go and do some practice, because it'll save you all sorts of headaches. On to the nitty-gritty of actually getting through controlled airspace. A lot of guys I talk to really do avoid it like the plague, but the fact is they're missing out for several reasons. Main ones being you'll get direct routings, obviously, which will save you time and fuel, and forget the controllers are there to keep you safe and away from danger and violations. And actually the CAA is doing its best to encourage you all to take that direction. Skyway code actually says GA pilots sometimes end up flying convoluted routes in an effort to avoid controlled airspace, when in fact it would be safer and more efficient to obtain a transit through it. Also, if you ask a controller early during a transit, the earlier the better, to be honest, to give them plenty of time. They'll often hand you over to the next unit along your route. They call that pre-noting, and that will save you the blind call, full call. So transit can often be a lot easier and a lot safer than going around it. So it's good practice for many reasons. So let's see how we go about it. It is fair to say, as I've seen in the chat box, you may not be given a clearance in certain areas around the country, which is a shame. Darren, I'm interested later to ask your opinion on it. But on the assumption that you probably will, maybe Newcastle and some others, let's talk more about it then. So on to preparation. As usual, and the most out of your flight starts with sound preparation. So on a VFR flight, do take a good look at the en route weather and prepare your transit ahead of time using a line on a map or your favorite electronic device. And make sure if you're using electronic devices like we did last time, make sure you've got a backup. I personally use Metform 215 for the big picture, and of course TAFs and METARs for the detail. Your electronic devices might also overlay the wind and the actual weather, like the rain feature on SkyDemon, for example. Brackets, others are available. And of course, the active wind arrows help you predict where any weather's actually likely to be as you move along your route. I find that really useful. Frequencies, VLPs and NOTAMs, things that you're going to need to have a handle on while you're flying near controlled airspace. Make a note of your frequencies before you get there, and make sure you're familiar with the names and positions of the local VRPs, visual reporting points. You can print out a blog. It's a great reference tool and for writing clearances, obviously. You may want to highlight or circle the information you actually like to use. There's an excellent blog feature in most of the apps, so I tend to do it all on the day and print it out, take it with me. Also check the relevant NOTAMs, which might affect your crossing or your route in general, of course. But remember, the NOTAM depiction on some electronic devices may not be fully accurate, like we've said before in our webinars. I'd just say that if a NOTAM is close to your track, check its position accurately with the online NOTAM source on the NATS AIP, so you don't infringe it if it's going to be relevant. Routing, often if I'm crossing an active airfield, I plan to route through the overhead so that I avoid approach and climb out traffic. You know, if you're planning to go through the extended centre line at 1,500 feet, the likelihood is you're going to be right in the way of approach and climb out. So the controller might, of course, give you a different route, especially if there's any likelihood of go around traffic or circuit traffic when you're passing through, but directly over the top is often the favourite. And of course, you'll get a good view of the airport too, which is interesting. Altitudes, the others have explained, you'll usually be given the local QNH fly on rather than the regional or the QFE, and expect to be given clearance something like not above or not below certain altitude VFR as part of your clearance, which of course you'll need to read. On to RT. Here are my thoughts on RT. Timing, do your best to call them at least 10 minutes before your entry. Make sure you include 4-zone transit at the end of the initial call. Sound confident. This is a good one. If you're out of practice, you might want to write down and read out the initial call as clearly and professionally sounding as you can. If you sound confident, I find they're much more likely to give you exactly what you want, especially in really busy airspace like the Heathrow Control Special Zone. My strong advice, if you need it, would be to practice a few routes with an instructor, give you the knowledge and confidence you need. There are a few practice RT apps. There's one called Readability 5, which isn't free, but my students, I'm sure there are others, my students, it's really good for the RT license prep. Equally, I think it's that type of products for practice if you are simply out of practice. Note down clearances, more difficult for helicopter pilots, but if you can, and for read purposes and for when you need to check the detail later, once you've forgotten it, write down your clearances. For heli pilots, that's sometimes tricky. We usually just have to use our memories. If you can't write with your left hand, you can practice swapping hands until it's second nature. And I certainly teach that to my students, and they like that a lot. Readbacks, following on from that last point, I often find it helps to read the clearance in the order it was given, because it rolls off the tongue more easily while you can still kind of hear it in your head. And it does help to be familiar with the order, the usual order, if you like, that the clearance is given, because that makes readbacks easier too. Say again, that's a great call. If you miss part of the clearance, read back what you can remember, then just ask them to say again the squawk or whatever. Radar control, as Darren said, remember to expect them to tell you you're under radar control as you cross the boundary. You need to read that back. And then do note your heading and your altitude and fly accurately and maintain VFR with a good lookout, and call anything you think is relevant, which you might have to change your heading or height to avoid. Requests. If you'd like to pre-note a handover to an onward unit, as I mentioned earlier, you can ask them most briefly using the call G for Bravo Charlie Delta request, just that, which allows the controller time to prepare to write down your request, rather than coming out with a long-winded statement that he doesn't have time to write down. So assuming he's not too busy, they'll then pass on your details to the next unit by telephone, which saves you a full call as you exit. And you will often just have to change the frequency and make the call with your call sign and the squawk, and that's it. Example here, if you're flying a straight line from Gloucester to Fair Oaks, as I do a lot via the Bry Zone, your route would also take you through the Benson Southern Stub, and asking guys to pre-note Benson with your routing wouldn't be considered an unusual request at all. And then Wilco, I will comply, saves a lot of radio time and is preferred by controllers if the information doesn't have to be read back like a clearance would. For example, Golf Mike Echo, report Fair Oaks in sight, Golf Mike Echo, Wilco. Wilco, Golf Mike Echo. Finally, on RT in general, keep your call as succinct as you can. For instance, as I said, use request before, but also remember the call unable. That's another good one too. I'm sure Darren will agree with that. Use it when they tell you to do something you can't do, maybe for weather or performance. You just can't do what they're asking. It's a really succinct call, which gives them a chance to give you an alternative. Just remember that someone else on frequency or the controller may well have a really important call you need to make while you're giving them out a long transmission. Anyway, let's look about nav and potential rerouting. So thanks. Here's the routing I spoke about earlier through BIS. Remember, don't actually enter the airspace until you're cleared. And if you're two-way with the controller, but haven't yet been specifically cleared. If there's a lot of radio traffic while you're trying to get a word in, yeah, you'll have to make, you may well have to take up an orbit or slow down or both, but make sure you stay clear, and also do watch out for a tailwind, which might push you in while you're orbiting, actually in your orbits. So tailwinds can really catch you out. Laying action, expect to be held, climbed or routed around potential go around or circuit traffic, as I said before, while you're in the zone or even before you enter. Requests for changes to routing. Request any changes in route you need for any reason, say weather. Bearing in mind you're under radar control, so you can't just change your heading or routing without asking first. Rerouting by ATC, you may be asked to reroute via a VRP or an easily recognizable ground feature, maybe like overhead the airfield itself or a nearby town. If you're unsure what they're asking you, just ask them, say it again, or give you a vector even. Lookout, remember, as Darren said, you're still responsible for seeing and avoiding other VFR traffic in Class D. So keep your lookout going and call anything you see if they haven't told you about the traffic already. Electronic conspicuity devices are really helpful, an early heads up, but remember they're not infallible and they don't yet at least show everything that's out there. So let's say it's all gone well so far, it's time to prepare to exit the controlled airspace. So next slide, please, thanks. Leaving the zone. Expect them to tell you you're about to leave, as I said. They'll often ask you or tell you which type of service you like outside or you're going to get, and just tell them or acknowledge it and prepare yourself for the next frequency change or handover if you've asked for one, if they've got a pre-note for you. Lookout, keep the lookout going and general awareness. And as before, keep any electronic conspicuity devices on a sensible range scale. If you have one, say it's showing relevant traffic and isn't cluttered. Handover or pre-noting or free call en route. Once you're ready to move on, you'll either be given a new squawk for the next unit or simply be told to squawk conspicuity and change en route if they're busy. From my example route, as might either say squawk 1234 for Benson and call them 120.9, or if they're busy, they could just say squawk conspicuity and free call Benson 120.9, good day, and that's it, on you go. So the whole process is really straightforward once you've planned it, thought it through, and braved it a few times, and realize it's a much better and safer process all round. So finally, as I said earlier, do have a chat with your local friendly instructor if you're feeling a bit nervous about it. Ask for some top tips about your local control zones and areas, or ask them if they can take you on a practice flight with them. I'd say that's money well spent and get you into better habits. So that's all I've got. Thanks very much for listening. Feel free to leave any questions for me in the chat box. And back to Chris, thanks.
There we go. Thank you, Dave. Nothing for me at this particular point, so we'll move rapidly on to top tips for staying out of trouble and back to Darren, if that's okay. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Before we get into detail, as ever, let's have a quick poll. Question should be appearing on your screen very shortly. So if you receive a clearance that would take you into cloud and you don't hold a current instrument rating restricted, what should you do? Follow that clearance, contact the controller and ask them for a climb so you can get above the cloud, contact the controller and tell them you're unable to comply, or a bit while you think about it. Particularly pertinent following the recent publication of a tragic incident, which I'm sure many of the viewers will be familiar with. But let's have a look at the answers. Yeah, of course, really pleasing to see that the vast majority there have gone for telling the controller that you are unable to comply. Unable is the least used word in CAT 413. And as a controller of many years, I really wish it had been used much more frequently. If you're unable, you need to let the controller know as soon as possible, and it's their job to adjust accordingly. So let's look at some top tips then, really, for staying out of trouble when you find yourself in controlled airspace. Don't assume. Check. Again, say again and unable, most underutilized words in CAT 413. If you're not sure what the controller said, please, please, please ask again and again and again until you're absolutely certain. Most controllers will be slightly frustrated, but would much rather say again half a dozen times knowing that you've got the correct information than you do something that they weren't expecting and end up somewhere where you shouldn't be. Likewise, number 2, if you're in any doubt, shout. ATC are there to help, and don't be afraid to ask for it when you need it. You might feel as though you're the little minnow flying through the big airspace with all the big shiny jets, but you are receiving that service, and the controllers are there to help you out. And 99 times out of 100, they will. You could even request vectors if you're lost, you're uncertain of your position, or you need specific help to get you out of trouble. Ask. If you can't remember the phraseology to ask specifically, just use plain language. But controllers are without doubt there to help, and it's really, really important that you use those services effectively. Okay, thinking about your flight profile. Any rapid heading changes or level changes can kind of catch the controller unawares. There's always a potential for TCAS issues if you're climbing and descending quickly, and I think we'll pick up on that a little bit later on. But if you are changing level rapidly or changing direction unexpectedly, those are the types of things that the controllers will potentially be concerned about, potentially be worried about. Let them know what you're doing, let them know why you're doing it, let them know what's going on. Flight profile also applies to where you're going to transit. Dave mentioned transiting through the overhead is generally a preferred option because it's the path of least conflict with transiting traffic. Aircraft flying an approach to land will be 3,000 feet at 10 miles, etc. So don't expect to transit 10 miles from the threshold at 3,000 feet. You're going to be in everybody's way. So your flight profile is key. Think about the level that you're going to use. Picking up the poll question, remaining in VMC, absolutely vital that you remain within the conditions of your license and the conditions of your clearance. You're told to maintain VFR, remain VMC, whatever the phraseology might be. It's your job to do that. Don't accept a clearance that will take you into cloud. Don't accept something that will put you in danger. Unable, and the controller will come up with an alternative clearance that will hopefully keep you safe. If you don't get a service or a clearance, and there are lots of comments with regard to refusals of airspace transit, we do have an option to report that. CAA have a portal, FCS 1522 form. You'll find it on the CAA website. I think the link's going to be posted into the chat for everybody. It's really important that we do use that when the service hasn't been provided or a clearance has been refused, so that the CAA can collect that data and collate that data and make sure that we're all getting the service that we're entitled to. We've got equal access to airspace as everybody else, and it's important as VFR flyers that we make that known. If you've had a refusal, if you've had a failure to provide the service, please use that report form. Not for how far back you can do retrospectively, but if you've found that and you found yourself in that situation, you haven't reported it, I'd encourage you to go back and put that in. Lots of questions about what happens to that process, and I think that's something we'll need to take away and follow up in a bit more detail, Chris. But the portal is there specifically for that reason, to make sure that airspace is being properly and adequately managed with fair access for all. I think that covers the tips for me, Chris. Over to you.
Perfect, thank you. We used to finish with the top 3 things. We've gone for top 5 this evening. So there you go. There's your 5 top tips for a very experienced air trafficker. Thank you very much for that. Right, let's move on to the final bit, which is questions. Got loads of time for questions tonight, so keep them coming. We've got plenty coming in already, but keep them coming, please. I'm going to start at the top, and let's go with one from Lawrence. This is one for Darren, I think. GA is less about A to B transits, but orbiting landmarks and following rivers, etc., as we all know. This is why we don't like controlled airspace. How can we keep these freedoms in controlled airspace? Thoughts on that one?
Well, I think the obvious thing is the points that we've raised this evening. If you sound confident, if you've planned in advance, if you've got an alternative up your sleeve, and you know where you're going to go and what you're going to do it, there's a good chance that you will get the transit. As I say, I've transited. I've never been refused in 25 years of flying as P1, as passenger, as all sorts. Just knowing what you can do and how to get away. Yeah, I've been orbited, I've been held, I've had a few reroutes and diversions, but I've never found it to be problematic, and certainly a lot quicker and easier than avoiding the airspace from the outset. I see Bristol coming up a few times there. I flew down from Gloucester to the Glastonbury overhead when the festival was on, with the transit from Bristol in both directions with absolutely no problem at all in the RV.
Great. I think also we go back to the bits we were talking about earlier about VRPs within the zone, etc. as well. That also, you know, some of those VRPs and some of those visual routes might actually follow line features, for example, for ease of use around the zone. So whilst it's not a freedom per se, it does allow GA traffic to, you know, use anchor points, use references, and get through that airspace. So cool. Right. Thank you. Right. Another one coming back to you, Darren, if I may. Why does clear of cloud below 3,000 feet not apply in Class E airspace?
It comes from the ICAO classifications and how ICAO manage Class E. So the 1,500 meter, the 5K 1,500 meters vertically, 1,000 feet horizontally applies. However, you don't need a clearance as a VFR aircraft in Class E airspace. You can transit Class E airspace without a VFR clearance. So I guess in those circumstances, you could just press on.
Thank you. Okay, this is one from David. This one's heading to Matt. So, Matt, I understand that ATC may not necessarily contact someone on FMC, so listening squawks, if their aircraft is in danger of breaching airspace. Would it not be intelligent to do so given the paperwork involved? Question mark. How many infringements have there been of aircraft using listening squawk since the system was introduced? In other words, does using a listening squawk prevent controlled airspace breaches?
I don't have any statistics to hand, but the point is that the controller is not resourced to be able to do kind of flight watching of all of the tracks on their screens and what they're doing. So they might not even notice that you're about to infringe controlled airspace. They're not obliged to provide you with any kind of service on a listening squawk there as well. So while some units and controllers may, if they have capacity and if they spot it, they may elect to try and contact you and try and warn you. That's very much a kind of freebie, if I can put it like that as well. So there is actually, they're not resourced, they don't have any obligation to do that. It's not that they don't want to do it, but a controller may simply not have the capacity to be watching what everybody's doing and whether they're flying towards controlled airspace. So I don't think the frequency monitoring code, the listening squawks, and a basic service, which is ultimately behind all of this, are actually configured to be able to do that kind of anti-infringement service. So just not resourced to do it as well. Darren may have a view as well. He's obviously on the other end of the RT with this, and has probably been providing a service under a listening squawk at times.
I think you hit the nail on the head, Matt. It's there to assist controllers as very much an extra, as an aside to what's going on. There is no obligation for them to monitor what's going on. Trust me, the last thing controllers want to do is file paperwork. So if they can avoid an infringement by talking to somebody on a listening squawk, I'm sure they'll do, but sure they will do. But it's not always possible to monitor everything that's going on.
Okay, thank you. Right, this one's from Richard. Does having a Mode S transponder give you a better chance of obtaining a transit than a Mode A or C transponder?
That depends on the capability of the air traffic unit, really. Not all of them have Mode S radar capability. So sometimes the additional information that Mode S is chirping away from your transponder isn't seen by ATC. It shouldn't make any difference at all. Mode Charlie will help enormously. Any vertical data is hugely beneficial, so make sure you're using altitude encoding on your Mode Charlie transponder. But it shouldn't make a vast amount of difference, other than for those units that do have Mode S capability.
Cool, thank you. Okay, this one's from David. He says, transiting Bryce recently for practice. He heard another VFR fly also under radar control, which he thought may be conflicting, but he couldn't see. Would you flag that to air traffic? How about Dave for that one? Would you flag it?
Yes, I absolutely would. So I was trying to find the unmute button. I was actually just typing an answer for that. If you can't see it, just tell them you can't see it. No visual or whatever, and they will give you much more information on the aircraft until you can see it. Or they'll, if you're really concerned about it, then they'll give you a new heading. And would you agree with that?
Yeah, traffic not sighted will be beneficial, even though the controllers are under no obligation to separate VFR traffic. Air proxies and mid-air collisions generate an awful amount of paperwork, and it's something that most will try and avoid. Generally speaking, if it looks like you're getting close, a controller will point it out to you. But remember, they're not obliged to. It is still your lookout that's key. But yeah, as I said in the key points, if you're in any doubt, shout, ask for help, ask for an update on the traffic.
And the other thing I'd add as well is when you're doing that as well, especially if you're going through big places like Briars, remember the issues of wake turbulence and wake turbulence separation, and that can also be the same with rotary traffic as well, if you're in rotary units as well. So it's not just about keeping clear. You want to think about what separation that you need to take on big stuff as well. Something like the A400M, when it's got some flap down and they generates a lot of wake as you go through there as well.
Great, thanks. This one's coming to Darren. This one's from Philip. Can you still get a zone transit if your aircraft is not transponder equipped?
In theory, yes, it's possible. In practice, it's harder for the controller. They'll need to identify you by giving you a turn. They need to observe your period of your track, give you a turn of 30 degrees or more, watch you make that turn, and use the primary radar to identify you. So it's a little bit of extra workload. It shouldn't preclude a zone transit, but it is a little bit harder for the controllers involved, particularly if you're at range and there's any weather clutter and the primary radar performance isn't particularly good. But it shouldn't preclude it, but just more work for the controllers.
And just to add to that as well, frequently at Briars we get gliders transiting the zone as well through competitions, and that happens quite frequently. The glider will call up. They'll be non-transponder equipped, and clearly they can't take exact routings and that. But quite often I've heard the controllers say, "Yeah, you're clear to route north to south or whatever. If you're going to descend below altitude, 2,500 feet, please call me," or whatever. So it does happen even with, like say, gliders that have often not equipped with transponders, and often very variable flight tracks as well.
Cool. Okay, this one's from Paul. It's going back a few years now. Why did we change from Flight Information Service to Basic Service when the continent still uses FIS? Discuss.
I don't think we got time to get me off of my complete soapbox. Suffice to say that I'm not a big fan of they're not new anymore. They're very old. But we made a bit of a dog's dinner of Flight Information Service in the UK with deconfliction, traffic, basic service, etc., and made it overly complex, unique to the UK, and not particularly good. It was driven by the different ways, primarily driven by the different ways that military and civilian controllers handled traffic, on a number of recommendations from the Airprox board, and including an accident too. So there was a need to do something. But I'm personally not a big fan of what happened. The pleasing news is that the future airspace strategy is already talking about reverting to an ICAO-based flight information service. So we're almost certainly at some point in the not too distant future. It might take a few more years to roll that out, going back to something much more sensible and pragmatic. It's not popular with controllers either. It's back in the days of perhaps gold plating stuff that we used to do, but bear with it. I'm sure it'll change to something much more sensible and pragmatic soon.
The accident that Darren alludes to was two F-15s that crashed into Ben McDewey in 2001. It was a very it sent a lot of waves through the military controlling and flying community as well. And there was a lot of recommendations and issues that came out of that report. And I think it drove some of the UK thinking. But it's an interesting report to read if you're looking at researching safety topics and the history of things.
Cool. Thank you. Right, this one is. I'll be interested to see your thoughts on this one, Darren. Actually, so this one's from Lewis. He says he doesn't intend to. Good caveat. But if you do infringe airspace, do air traffic tell you, or do you get a formal letter from the CAA or that aerodrome?
It's a bit of hot potato there, and that a lot of chatter in various fora about ATC being out to get you and causing trouble and all that type of stuff. If you infringe controlled airspace, the controller is legally obliged to file an MOR, mandatory occurrence report, within 72 hours, because you've entered the airspace without clearance, and that gets sent to the CAA, and the various departments of the CAA will look at that from a flight crew licensing point of view, from an ATC point of view, perhaps from an operations point of view, and decide what course of action ought to be taken. I wouldn't go into any more detail because that's still a fairly fluid and dynamic situation, depending on the nature and the extent of your of the infringement. But controllers must report; they are legally obliged to report airspace infringements. Nobody likes doing it because it's something you end up having to do on your break. It takes time, takes a fair bit of resource, but they have to do it. They're not doing it out of spite. It's something that has to happen. And I think you're more likely to hear from CAA as the regulatory authority than the ATC unit itself. That said, some ATC units will potentially, if they've got the time and resource to do it, talk to you about the process, why it happened, what happened, perhaps ask to talk to you on the landline once you've landed it and get some feedback as to why it happened. The whole basis of reporting, and people will be aware of kind of the just culture, isn't to get you in trouble. It's to make sure that everybody learns from the incident and it doesn't happen again.
Thank you. Right, some more questions coming in thick and fast here. We've got another one from Kaylee. Says, while receiving radar service in controlled airspace, could a controller ever reroute you via a place/VRP not marked on your map?
Potentially, though, it tends to happen the other way. People will call up with a GPS-based reference. I'm 2.3 miles southwest of Little Snobbery on the Whatsit, which is utterly meaningless to the controller. So stick to the published VRPs, the information that does appear on your chart, and that'll be really helpful. Flipping that around, if you don't know where you're being asked to reroute, as I said, if in doubt, shout. Ask the controller for assistance. Tell them you're not familiar, can't find that on the chart. Request vectors if needs be. The controllers are there to help, and if you don't understand, just ask them to clarify.
Great stuff, thank you. This one's from Ian for Dave, I think. MATS is, so military air traffic zones, to be treated in the same way as civil controlled airspace.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, technically, a MATS is Class G airspace. The ATZ has its own rules, of course. You can technically go through through a MATS without asking, but I would never do that. I would always ask for clearance through the MATS, and they'll often say you clear through the MATS and avoid the ATZ. A bit like this, if you know, it's basically busy military airspace, and could be an awful lot of aircraft flying around different flight speeds, and you could infringe. You could just get close to them. So no, yes, technically you can just go through it. I wouldn't.
Okay, great, thank you. This one's from Brooklyn. This is about the three methods of PSR, so identification from a controller to an aircraft. The suggestion is the three are the turn method, which you've mentioned already, 30-degree turn, ident, or SSR squawk. Are there any other methods for identification, Darren?
There are geographical methods. If an aircraft reports over a a prominent geographical feature that's marked on the controller's radar chart, radar map, he can that can be used as a point of identification. And departure methods. If an aircraft is seen within a mile of the end of the runway, it correlates with the departure time, then we can take that as identified. It's unusual. It's relatively unusual to have prominent geographical features that are widely published and known, but it's possible.
And Darren, I think it's fair to say certain units, if you're on a listening squawk, may call you up having taken your identity from the Mode S return. I know Oxford do that fairly frequently.
Yeah, that's the beauty of Mode S. That all that data is at the controller's fingertips potentially. So yeah, it's hugely beneficial. And again, as we see more units switching to Mode S and more aircraft operating Mode S transponders, it makes the controller's job and the interoperability between us that much easier.
Great stuff. Okay, last few coming up here. What have we got? We've got, I think I know the answer to this one, but I'm going to test you on this one, Darren. This is coming from someone that says, do controllers know all the airfields, including the more obscure farm strips, for example? I would suggest not. Unless you're going to tell me that all air traffickers are absolute sky gods and gurus and know everything, which you
No, they're
not.
No, absolutely. If it appears on an aeronautical chart, there's a good chance that ATC will know about it. If it's within their controlled airspaces, they'll almost certainly know about it because there will have been some coordination going on, presumably with the operator. If it's a little strip outside controlled airspace that only a handful of people know about, then it's unlikely that they will. And think about the geographical aspects of this as well. The NATS controllers who look after Stansted and Luton and Gatwick and Heathrow aren't based at those airfields. They're all down at Swanwick at that centre there. So again, if you tell them you're 2 miles west of some random village in Essex, it's probably not something they're going to be familiar with. The homegrown people, places like Birmingham, where the controllers live and work in that area, there's a good chance they might know where the strips are. There are still a number of us controllers who are active PPLs and enjoy flying. So again, there's some familiarity on that side. But it's not always the case. There's no longer any mandatory flying training for controllers that there used to be 30 plus years ago. So there are people in the industry with relatively limited exposure to general aviation. You can change that as well. To take cakes and single malt whiskies to your local tower, and you're pretty much guaranteed a visit, I would think.
And just to back Darren up on that as well, most areas of the countries now are covered by regional airspace user working groups as well. If you can get yourself to an invite to that, you can get some really good cooperation and that going as well. One of the ones I was involved with as well, we discovered that a quite active private flying strip was not shown on any of the military charting. So actually by part of that user working group, we managed to get some information. We managed to get the military charts updated to show that strip so that some of the crews could avoid it in their pre-flight planning. That was a direct result of that. So if you've got a concern or what about some of your activity, do try and get in touch if there's an airspace user working group. That they can be really effective.
Thank you. This one's from Martin. It's definitely a Dave question, this one, for the PPLH. He's talking about letting down as a helicopter in controlled airspace. Any advice regarding letting down to private sites in controlled airspace, Dave?
Yeah, absolutely. I've literally just answered that actually, Chris, but to make the point, they'll usually just tell them where your private site is. They'll usually be familiar anyway, because it would be unusual if it was just some arbitrary field. But even if it was, you could describe where it is in relation to another more prominent feature, and just request zone entry rather than zone transit, and tell them where the site is, call its in sight and that you're letting down. They'll give you a clearance, and they'll quite often say, call us before you lift on the way back out, and then but otherwise you call them in exactly the same way. There's not a problem.
Cool.
And have you got anything to add to that from a controller's perspective?
Again, familiarity, landing at a private site 10 miles south of your location rather than landing at the King's Head or whatever it might be, that might not be immediately familiar to the controllers, but range and bearing or location reference to something geographical will help them.
Good stuff, thank you. This is an interesting one about Sky Echo, actually, from Tony. How many ATC units can see Sky Echo? Because it doesn't have a transponder. Can a Sky Echo be seen? No traffic?
Not necessarily. Not an electronic gadget and gizmo guru. If everybody had mode S, it'd make things a lot easier. Some of the, interestingly, although it's not an air traffic unit, Barton have really recently just had approval to use something called FIS, I think, flight information data, where basically they're pulling all the data from various of the multilateration or ADSB sources and putting that on a display for the FISOs at Barton. Now, the FISOs can't give you clearances or traffic information. They're not within controlled airspace, but it does give them a better picture of everything that's happening around them. I think we'll see increasing use of that once collectively we decide on what the best option's going to be for electronic conspicuity. Again, this is all going to come up as part of the future airspace strategy. It's kind of challenging at the moment, but it's unlikely that ATC will see your gadget or gizmo unless it's associated with a transponder.
So some units will be using internet or app-based alongside. They can't use it to control or give bona fide traffic information as well. But certainly some of the units around the Bryce-Benson gap will, if you're on a traffic service, they will say there's a large gaggle of gliders in the, I don't know, Shrivenham area, believed to be between 2,000 and 4,000 feet or something like that, using some information that they've sourced. But that's not qualified information, and they're not obliged to give you that, and they may just be able to give you a heads up. It literally is that. Based on some of that information. But like I say, as Darren comes, some of the FID adoptions may be able to be more certified, if I use that word loosely.
Yeah, exactly. That's a key point. And the CAA have actually now published guidance for air traffic, for ANSPs and navigation service providers, air traffic units, as to how they can incorporate and how they can use that information, what limitations there are on it. You're never going to be given a radar service based on something which is as accurate as your mobile phone, but clearly there's a lot of useful and pertinent and helpful safety related data out there. So as we move forward, we'll see better use of that, hopefully.
Right. I think Matt's just going to cover regional airspace working groups again, and then I think that'll be us on the questions.
No, I answered it in the type. Actually, I inadvertently clicked the live, so I'll put the terminology in the box. So Lewis should be able to pick that up.
Great, thank you. Lovely. Right, thank you for all of your participation and all the questions. That's great. We got through 21 questions there, and really good interaction in the chat box. So that's been fantastic. We do hope you've been able to take something away from this evening. As a reminder, if there's anything you would like to revisit, a replay of this workshop will be sent to you via email with a list of resources, supporting resources as well. Okay. If in doubt, though, go to our website, www.astralaviationconsulting.com, and there's, as I said before, a whole host of safety resources there. Give us about 24 hours, and all of the replays for this and other various supporting items will be there as well. Once we finish tonight, a survey will pop up. Please do take the time to fill this in, because your feedback is really valuable to us, because it helps us focus on what we're going to do next. If you are wondering what's coming up next, then please, again, keep an eye on our website, because we've got some other stuff coming up towards the end of the year, a couple more of these workshops as well, with a few twists as well. So that'd be good. Okay, however, we are pushing the time this evening. Thank you again for all of your contributions. The only thing that remains for me to say is a big thank you to Darren, Matt, and Dave. Really appreciate the team this evening. Good work, thank you. And also, again, thank you to all of you for your participation. I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks ever so much.